Good morning, everyone. I've really enjoyed Dr. Simmons' presentation. We should all probably pay him a few $1,000 at least. That was a condensed version of property law course. So rather than spending $40,000 for that course, you all just got it. So we should all thank Dr. Simmons. It was a really, really good presentation and explained property law without the without any political slant, really. It was just dead on of what our rights are. So I really appreciated that. Yesterday, while I was flying into California, I was thinking about how frightening it would be to live in California right now. And that's not just because of the taxes or all the other things you hear, but because of the wildfires. Last year in 2017, it was California's biggest wildfire year. And I have some stats to show that, and it's frightening to read those stats. Even more frightening is that wildfires are on the rise, and that's a fact. People on both sides of the aisle agree that wildfires are on the rise. And so over about 10 years ago, my family and I, specifically my father, began looking at wildfires and saw that they are on the rise. And the problems with wildfires. Wildfires are killing millions of animals, and they're spewing billions of pounds of pollution into the environment each year. This is something that's not talked about, or it hasn't been talked about much. But this last year, it's hit the mainstream media. And that's a good thing that it's making there, and hopefully it will stop. But we need to remember that principle, and that's the basis of my talk today. Is that millions of animals are being killed by wildfires, billions of pounds of pollution are being spewed. Let that sink in. So I'd like to just begin. This is the third year I've come to the symposium, and I'm really grateful for everyone that's helped put this on and brought us all together. And I want to begin just by giving you some background about our family and how we got into this. And then also I want to give you some new facts about wildfires, and specifically how they relate to California. So to begin, I'm a fifth-generation descendant of Elko County, Nevada. Elko County, Nevada is one of the largest counties in the country. It's one of the largest cattle producers as well. And my great-great-great-grandfather, Glazier, was our first ancestor that came to the Elko area. Down to my father, he grew up on a ranch in Star Valley, Nevada, and that's what Trent was just speaking about, where he was. And Star Valley is a beautiful place. It's in the Ruby Mountains of Nevada. And my dad, while he grew up there, he was born in the 40s and then grew up there in the 50s. He saw that there was more cattle grazing on the land than ever before, more than now. There's also more sheep grazing on the land. And they had a hunting camp for mule deer, and people would fly in from all over the country and really the world to come and hunt there. And it was amazing how much deer was there. My dad learned that there was a symbiotic relationship between grazing and the cattle and sheep and the wildlife populations. And those wildlife populations boomed. They could go out and see. My uncle, he made a documentary about seeing 50 bucks in just one day, large bucks, just in this small range. I went and hunted last year in that same range, and I hunted all day and didn't see one, and went to the same ranges. So it's unfortunate that those populations have now died down. During the same period, though, there were no or limited wildfires. There were not many, but now it's grown, and it's correlated with the amount of grazing. Here's a picture of my father. He's second from, I guess, your left there, and after a day of hunting. And he has tons and tons of pictures like this, and there were lots and lots of wildlife. So my father, he began seeing that there was a rise in wildfires, and he was really concerned about that. And he had always heard the Forest Service put out Smokey Bear, and he had heard about, I guess it's kind of propaganda, that only you can prevent wildfires or forest fires. And so my father, he came up with the idea of smoked bear. So Smokey Bear was a bureaucrat and worked for the bureaucracies, and he pointed the finger saying only you can prevent wildfires. Smoked bear, however, was an industry in forestry and in mining and in grazing and ranching. And he was a brown bear, and he saw that reducing the fuels on the land will reduce wildfires. And that was the principle that he came up with. And so my dad, he helped promote this. He made radio spots and shared them around, and he's gotten the message out. And I've been promoting that as well. And now we're actually seeing some fruits of all of this hard work and the statements of smoked bear. So here's a picture of my father with smoked bear, and it was the first public appearance that smoked bear made at the Bear Wallow Fire in Arizona. So I don't know if many of you remember the Bear Wallow Fire, but it was the largest wildfire in Arizona history. It burned 538,000 acres. That is a staggering number. 538,000 acres it burned. And the sad thing was in the forest there, the logging had been stopped, and it was because of an endangered species, the spotted owl. So they weren't allowed to go and log there anymore. And if you look at this forest, if you can see it very well, it's not well taken care of. It's really, really overgrown. And so there was a lot of fuel in this forest, which was just a tinderbox. And it doesn't matter if a human starts it or if lightning strikes. There's going to be a spark at some point. And this was the result. 538,000 acres were burned. So when my father started smoked bear, he started talking to biologists, ranchers, people that are on the ground, environmentalists, about how many animals live on an acre. And as he spoke with them, he came up with the number of 3. 3 vertebrates live per acre, and that's just on rangeland. There's probably even more in forests. But he came up with that conservative number just so people could see the magnitude that wildfires are having on the animal population. So if we look at the Bear Wallow Fire, 1.6 million animals would have been burned in that fire, and that's a very, very conservative number from all the experts that we've spoken to. So this is actually a picture of a large game that was burned, and when they went and visited the Bear Wallow Fire, this wasn't just a secluded site. This was all over the place. There were a lot of animals that were burned and killed in this wildfire. And beyond that, there were a lot of wildlife that either had their paws burned and that would eventually die, or there were many animals as well that were displaced, and that they wouldn't have a place to come back to, and they would eventually die as well. So wildfires have a tremendous effect on wildlife. And so my father, he also started looking into pollution, and he asked me while I was in college to look into how much pollution wildfires spew. And so I started doing some research, and there wasn't much, there weren't very many studies out there that I could find. And actually, in some of the studies I found, it was clear that some of the scientists didn't want the information about wildfire pollution to get out because they knew that it would hurt all of their efforts to reduce industrial pollution because of the magnitude of wildfire pollution. So one study that I found, it followed an Alaska wildfire that burned just for 3 months. That one fire that burned for 3 months in Alaska spewed over 66 billion pounds of just carbon monoxide in 3 months. That's more carbon monoxide, more industrial pollution than all of the United States produces in 1 year combined. So that is a massive, massive, massive number. So, and to put that into comparison, I looked at one of the biggest polluters in the country, which is ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil produced about 9.82 million pounds of pollution that year. And so in comparison, if you look at those, here's that Alaska on a graph, that Alaska wildfire, and ExxonMobil. It doesn't even show up on this bar graph. The ExxonMobil, over 1 year, out of all the pollutants that it spewed, it only polluted 0.015% of that Alaska wildfire that's spewed for 3 months, and that's just carbon monoxide. So that is a tremendous, tremendous number. Wildfires pollute like nothing else. The scary thing is, when we began looking at this, is how the government is managing this. And as you can see here, the land management planning has, the funding for it is on the decline drastically, where fire suppression spending is on the rise tremendously. So what the government's chosen to do really is just to go and throw money on these fires, because the fires are just growing, and all they're doing is throwing money on it rather than coming up with a way to manage these wildfires and reduce the fuels. Last year when I spoke, I put these two maps up, and this was kind of one of my main points, that the federal government is the worst land manager in the country. And if you look at this, on the right, we have federal lands in the United States. And this is a map showing federal lands. The red, obviously, is the land that the federal government owns. On the left, that is areas that are most susceptible to wildfires. And as you can see, it correlates exactly with the federal land ownership. No, at my house, I'm not going to allow fuel to accumulate in order for a wildfire to blaze and burn down my house. No landowner would do that. But the federal government allows that to happen, and that's very, very unfortunate. So now that you're caught up, I want to go forward about some new facts and evidence about what's going on with wildfires, and I want to specifically focus on California, specifically California in 2017, which was the worst, as I said, the worst wildfire year on record in California history. So to give you some facts about California wildfires, 1.3 million acres were burned in California last year. 5 out of the 20 most destructive wildfires in California burned last year. So 5 of the 20 most destructive wildfires burned last year. 43 people were killed. And it's estimated 9,400 structures were destroyed. And it was frightening to wake up and actually see entire subdivision tracts burned to the ground. It was those photos, some of the drone pictures of those subdivisions that had burned to ground were it was scary. It was frightening that citizens are actually having their homes destroyed in these wildfires. It's affecting U.S. citizens directly. And $180 billion were spent either on suppressing the fires or in the damage caused by these wildfires. It's a tremendous, tremendous amount. So if we take that number of 3 animals, I'll let her get a picture of this slide. All right. If we take that number of 3 animals per acre and apply it to California, that's 4.1 million animals that were killed. This is a picture of a bird that was burned in the Bear Wallow Fire. But 4.1 million animals were killed in California wildfires last year. Any environmentalist that really cares about animals would be screaming this from the mountains, from the mountaintops. It would be on CNN, would be on Fox News, would be on everything, saying, "Hey, we have a serious, serious problem going on here." It's tragic. This statement. However, I was very, very grateful that this statement actually made national news. So for the last about decade, we've been making this argument that wildfires spew billions of pounds of pollution each year, and nobody was talking about But this last year in California, it made national news. NBC, this was a headline for NBC. It said, California wildfires emitted a year's worth of car pollution in less than a week. So I looked at the EPA numbers that this came from and did a little analysis. So the EPA tracks what's called particulates 2.5 micrometers in diameter or smaller. And these particulates are basically, when they're released, they're what cause humans harm, tremendous harm, by breathing them in. They're dangerous. And so based on the population rise from the EPA's last numbers and also on the rise in wildfires as well, that's what these numbers came from. So in California last year, 1.24 billion pounds of these particulates were spewed into the atmosphere last year, where California vehicles last year only spewed 22.5 million, and that's all highway vehicles. So to put these in comparison, that's California vehicles only spewed about less than 2% of all the wildfires spewed last year. So how many years would Californians have to drive their cars to equal 1 year of their wildfire pollution? 50 years. So every driver, every truck that was on the road last year, everyone that hit the highways last year would have to drive for 50 years, do the exact same thing for 50 years to equal what the wildfires did last year. And it's funny, reading about some of the policies in California, for instance, in San Francisco, they have a policy about wood stoves, how if you're going to build a new house or you're going to renovate your house, you can't have a wood stove because it's emissions and things. But it's laughable to compare that to the wildfires. I mean, the regulations and the policy is totally in the wrong place. We need to focus on wildfires. And the EPA also looked at the air quality indexes. So based on their air quality index, this is how they rate it. Beijing, China has about 50 to 150 on that index. And that's anywhere from good to unhealthy levels. And Beijing, as we know, is one of the probably one of the worst cities for pollutants when I think of a city. However, last year, San Rafael, California, on October 9th, had a level of 292, almost double what Beijing had. So very, very unhealthy, almost extremely unhealthy to live in San Rafael and go outside last year and breathe the air. So what can we do about this? Where can we look to improve our situation and reduce the wildfires that are out there? The place to look is, why are these wildfires burning? We know that they're on the rise. It's, as I said, both sides of the aisle, liberals and conservatives, believe that wildfires are on the rise. It's a fact. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a fairly liberal group. And this is an infographic that they produced showing that wildfires are on the rise since, they say, the 1980s. But what they're not showing is this graph from the U.S. Forest Service that shows timber sold and harvested from 1905 to 2016. You can see how timber has drastically been reduced. There's way, way, way less logging in the United States than there previously was. And that matches directly with the wildfires that are on the rise. Recently, in October 2017, the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce had a subcommittee, and this is where they talked about what the government's policy has been on wildfires. So prior to 1970s, they had a 10-acre policy, which was a very aggressive fire policy of putting out wildfires. Beginning in the 1970s, they implemented a let it burn policy, which probably many of you have heard of, and that's just letting wildfires burn. After the 1990s, they began to realize this is not sustainable, and so they determined that we need to remove unnatural fuel loads. However, they've ran into issues with the Environmental Policy Act and Endangered Species Act and other environmental laws which are prohibiting people from removing the fuels on the land. So we run into this cycle that's occurred. And starting here, we look at these regulations that have been implemented, the Endangered Species Act and so forth. And what that does is decrease logging and grazing. And so, as we saw in that graph, logging and grazing is decreased, which increases the fuels. As we saw in the Bear Wallow fire, logging was stopped, and the forest began to be choked to death. There was just too many trees and overgrown there. From that, we get one spark. We have increased wildfires, and then the media and a lot of environmental groups say that leads to global warming and endangering species. And then wrongly, they say we need more regulations. And so we have this continual cycle of more regulations which create more wildfires. And that's what's occurred since the 1950s. We've started getting into that cycle. And this needs to end, this idea that we need more regulations to protect the animals and protect the environment, because wildfires are the problem. We need to stop the fuels. And we need this pattern where we have increased local management that allows for more logging and grazing, which decrease the fuels, which will then decrease the wildfires because there will be less to burn and the land will be better managed. And then we'll have healthier forests and healthier animals. And that's the result that we all want. We all want that. Unless you're blind or lying, I think we all want a healthier environment and healthier animals. And the way to get there is reducing the fuels and managing the fuels on the land. What I've been happy to hear is in the last few years we're having some positive messages about this. So in 2016, the Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, and Utah U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service state supervisors put out a statement, and they said, "We support the ranchers' role as stewards." In 2017, this was one of the best minutes that I read, was from the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce Subcommittee. And their minutes almost precisely hit my whole presentation today. And their main point was we need to reduce the fuel loads, and regulations are hurting that objective of reducing the fuel loads. And then in March 2018, the BLM is going to implement an outcome-based grazing authorizations initiative. And what that is they're selecting specific ranches to have an outcome-based program where they allow the ranchers who know the land the best to determine how to manage the grazing on the land, and hopefully implement some ways that we can improve the land and help wildlife and also reduce the risk of wildfires. And so about that, Secretary Zinke, he said we need to enlist the ranchers in conservation efforts. And my dad, back in 2000, it would have been about 2012, he started some pilot projects in Elko County, and it was this exact idea. He stated, we can grow sage grouse on ranches. The ranchers can promote sage grouse and help wildlife and also reduce fuels, and that's what's being implemented here. So I'm praying that this will actually be a successful endeavor, and it'll permeate and go throughout ranchers, and hopefully we get that into our forests as well. So to conclude, our message is that we need to help grazing and we need to help forest rights. As I stated from the beginning, and millions of animals are being killed in wildfires, billions of pounds of pollution are being spewed. By stating that and helping people recognize that, we're gaining some traction. It's made it to the U.S. House of Representatives. The Secretary of the Interior is talking about it. It's making national news now, and it's, I believe, in large part because we've been speaking about this. Nobody was speaking about this before. So I implore each one of you, whenever you hear about a wildfire, whenever you see a wildfire, whenever a wildfire affects you, whenever somebody asks you or talks about a wildfire, make the comment that that wildfire killed millions of animals and spewed billions of pounds of pollution. If people start to understand that idea, that's going to help us be able to reduce wildfires by reducing the fuel levels on the land. Thank you very much for having me today.
Questions? All right, right here, Reed Smith. I'll hold the microphone for you.
I remember that part now. Thank you. A couple of comments, Zach. Approximately 1995, I was at the California Wheat Conference symposium, and an engineer from the U.S. or California Department of Conservation spoke about, and one of the points that he made was it had to do with water. And he was making the point that pre-Columbian California was basically burned to the ground every 3 years to prevent biomass accumulation. It increased feed for mammals, which was their food source, primary food source. They could know the count went up, but they could actually see them. So whether it's from the rabbit to the deer. And probably the most important point from that conversation was that he said that if we burned off all of the deep-rooted vegetation below 2,500 elevation in the state, it would increase the state's available water by more than 50%. Secondly, I was with Doyle Shenley up in Grass Valley, Nevada County with a presentation on Grass Valley currently has on average 400 trees per acre, which is going to end up at some point similar to Santa Rosa. He had come in and made a presentation to the Board of Supervisors to use federal money to come in and reduce that load from 400 to 40 sustainable trees per acre. The Board of Supervisors, a particular individual that badgered the rest of the supervisors into voting the proposition down, just openly calling Doyle a liar, even though Doyle had done this in multiple locations. My takeaway from observing these attempts to reduce fire load through conscious and premeditated mechanisms is that there was, on this Board of Supervisors, there was an individual that had an agenda from somebody that was not in the room, and that left me with the question of why would he do that and who was behind the end point. So, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Is that a question? You want to observe on that observation?
Yeah. I would just repeat that from what we've seen in Nevada, there were wildlife herds like never before in the 1950s and 1960s, but those have been drastically reduced. And wildfires on the rise. The Bear Wallow fire it has not helped the populations there. And by implementing logging and sustainable fuel level reduction, it would support wildlife, and it would help our environment as well, because billions and billions of pounds of pollution are being spewed by those wildfires. And if global warming is occurring, it's because of wildfires.
I just want to add to that, kind of on top of what Reed said. We probably know Hank Vogler, and you know him well from White Pine County, Nevada. I was at his place 2 years after he'd cut all the pinyon and junipers off of one section that he owned. And springs just started coming. Water just started coming out of the ground. And to Reed's point, we often forget about the water drain when you have too much fuel for fires. It's a double whammy.
Yep.
All right, next question.
So I kind of,
Kimberly.
sorry, that's really noisy. Sorry, Kimberly. I find it really
Fletcher.
interesting that when there is a forest fire, the way that the firefighters fight it is by burning. And so maybe we can tie in this idea of, hey, if it works to stop the fire, then why aren't we using it to prevent the fire? Or can we use that as a caveat of the conversation?
So there are prescriptive burns. I don't know if you're addressing that, but I think it's a better method to have logging and grazing that can actually use what's on the land for benefit, make economic, and it makes more economic sense than just burning it down. And also, we're dealing with a case right now where a prescriptive burn got out of control and went and burned a bunch of private property down. And the federal government doesn't want to take any responsibility for it. They don't want to pay anybody for it. And that's really unfortunate. That's exactly opposite, basically, of what happened in Oregon. So,
One final question. To hold the microphone.
Control freak. When I was
Roger Savory, you guys forget this part of the story.
Roger Savory, when I was listening to your talk and you had the cycle and the potential cures, you had that communities needed to have more involvement. I would wager that management needs to be holistic, and policy creation needs to be holistic, whereby a community is making decisions that are socially, economically, and environmentally sound, short and long term. But more importantly, none of our policies have a feedback loop that allows for, as soon as unintended consequences have been discovered, to revisit the policy to change it. And I think that's what you're witnessing, is the fact that none of our policies do have a feedback loop. So I would encourage you to think more about that in your presentations.
I agree. I like that idea. That's kind of right along the same lines that DeMar Dahl, he was one of my dad's friends and county commissioner in Elko, Nevada. He spoke with Trump when he was on the campaign, and Trump didn't really know much about the issues with public lands that we were dealing with here. And he said, why do people want to transfer the land, or why do they want more local control, things of that nature? And DeMar said, well, think if you had a 10-story hotel and somebody 2,000 miles away was controlling 8 floors of it, and you only got a say-so on two floors of it. How do you think the hotel would run? And immediately he got the idea, and it's because somebody that's not on the ground, somebody that's local, isn't dealing with those issues. And that's what a local manager does. They look at what the results are, and it's results-based rather than theoretical. We've got to look at what's actually occurring. And if we look at the past history, stopping logging, reducing grazing, it's not helping. We've got to look at the actual results. So I really do appreciate that comment.
Yeah, Tim Smith from Harney County, Oregon. Just a comment about the prescriptive burning. A timber sale was marked 3 times into the forest just above our house. They failed to carry out all 3 of those sales. So they decided to come in and prescribe burn that area. They came in, there was about 2 foot of duff underneath the tree. They failed to realize that duff was going to burn down and burn the roots. What happened then was that about 30% to 40% of those standing ponderosa pines were killed within 3 years because they had baked the roots underneath that duff. And so those trees now are standing and they're falling over and adding the fuel right back to the ground where they were before. So one size fits all on prescribed burning is not necessarily the answer. If they had logged those before, they would have generated revenue for our county, and instead of prescribed burning, which cost us, and then ended up wasting all that good timber.
Yep, that's exactly what the doctor was saying too about water rights. If we let bureaucracies come in and regulate the water rights, we're going to have a worse system. If we allow economics to regulate these things, it's actually going to promote the economy, and it's going to promote better range and better forests as well, and promote wildlife, because people on the ground, they don't want to just decimate a forest. They don't want to just decimate the rangeland. They know that that's their livelihood and it needs to continue to produce, so they're going to do what's needed for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Zach.